There is a specific kind of pain that doesn't show up in medical tests, doesn't leave visible marks on the body, and can't be explained to anyone in a way they truly understand. And that pain is invisibility, not physical invisibility, but that terrifying feeling that you could disappear at this very moment and nothing in the universe would change, no one would notice, no absence would be felt. And if you're here now, it's because on some deep level you know that feeling. You know what it's like to walk into a room and feel like it doesn't matter if you stay or if go. You know what it's like to speak and realize that your words simply don't go anywhere. As if there were an invisible barrier between you and the rest of humanity. You know what it's like to look in the mirror and not recognize the person looking back because that person has become so small, so erased, so absent from themselves that they no longer seem real. And the worst of all is not that others don't see you. The worst is that you yourself have begun to doubt that there is something in you worthy of being seen. Something in you that deserves to take up space in this world. Something about you that matters in the slightest in the grand scheme of things. Simone Weil, a French philosopher who lived only 34 years but who experienced this invisibility in ways so extreme that they almost completely destroyed her, wrote about this feeling with a surgical precision that cuts to the bone. She knew what it was like to feel less than human. She spent years of her life being ignored, underestimated, treated as if she were a problem to be solved or a voice to be silenced. But instead of running away from this unbearable pain, instead of trying to convince herself that it was just sensitivity exaggerated or emotional neediness, Simone Weil did something that very few people have the courage to do. She looked directly into the center of this invisibility. She inhabited this void with such radical attention that she transformed her own experience of not existing into a portal to a truth that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. And what she discovered was not an easy solution. It was not a self-help technique to finally be noticed by others. It was not a strategy to build self-worth through external achievements. What Simone Weil discovered was something infinitely deeper and infinitely more difficult to accept. She discovered that the invisibility you feel is not a defect in you. It is not evidence that you are inadequate or insufficient or worthless. Invisibility is in fact a specific kind of affliction that exists to reveal something about the nature of human existence that can only be seen when you are completely stripped of all comfortable illusions about who you are and what your place in the world. Have you ever stopped to wonder why so many people around you seem so sure of themselves, so present, so seen, while you feel like a ghost wandering among the living? Have you ever wondered if there is something fundamentally wrong with you that makes it impossible for others to really see you? Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you try, no matter how hard you try to be interesting or useful or worthy of attention, you always come back to that same place of emptiness where no one really sees you for who you are? What if I told you that Simone Weil believed that this feeling of invisibility, terrifying as it may be, might be exactly what your soul needs to finally awaken to a truth that no amount of external validation could ever reveal? And if you feel like these words are touching something deep inside you, something you didn't even know was waiting to be named, something you've been carrying alone for so long that you no longer remember what it's like to share it with someone, then subscribe to this channel now, because let's explore together a territory that most people are afraid to even acknowledge that it exists. We are going to walk the same dark paths that Simone Weil walked when she herself felt completely invisible and found on the other side not a magical cure, but a totally new way of existing, a way of being that doesn't depend on being seen by others because you have finally learned to see yourself with the eyes that really matter. And you won't want to miss what comes next, because what Simone Weil discovered about invisibility, about attention, and about the nature of the self will completely change not just how you feel about being ignored, but how do you understand your entire existence in this world that seems to have no space for you. You know that specific moment when someone looks right at you, but you know they're not really seeing you. Their eyes pass over you as if you were furniture, as if you were just part of the scenery, and you feel that contraction in your chest, that tightness in your throat that makes you want to scream, "I am here, I exist, I am, or real. But you don't scream because you've already learned that screaming doesn't make a difference. People will still not see you. Not because they are bad or intentionally cruel, but because for them, you are simply not in their field of vision. You don't register as a significant presence. You are invisible, not because you have physically disappeared, but because something in you has become transparent, imperceptible, insignificant in the eyes of others. And Simone Weil knew this experience intimately because she herself spent a large part of her life being treated as if it were a problem to be managed instead of a person to be seen. Since she was a child, she lived it. In the shadow of her brother André, a mathematical genius who shone so brightly that Simone often felt that her own light, if there was any light in her, was completely dimmed, she wrote about how at 14 she felt stupid, inadequate, worthless, as if there was nothing inside her that deserved attention or recognition. And this sense of invisibility only intensified as she grew older. When she tried to speak up in academic contexts, her colleagues often ignored her or patronized her. When she taught in secondary schools, was often seen as too eccentric, too intense, too problematic. When she worked in the Renault factories over 10 months in the years 1934 and 1935, she experienced the invisibility of the workers in such a brutal way that it almost broke something essential within her. She saw how the workers were treated as replaceable pieces of machinery, how their pains, their fears, their hopes simply didn't matter to those who had power over them. And Simone Weil began to understand that invisibility is not just an individual psychological phenomenon. It is social structure. It is a form of violence that reduces people to non-persons, that takes away from them even the basic right to be seen as human beings, worthy of attention and consideration. But here is what is crucial to understand about how Simone Weil dealt with this invisibility that threatened to destroy her. She did not try to become more visible in the conventional sense. She did not try to build a more impressive persona or gain recognition through external achievements. Instead, she did something completely counterintuitive. She began exploring her own invisibility as if it were territory to be charted. She asked herself what this feeling of not being seen was trying to reveal, not about other people, but about the nature of existence itself. And it was in this radical exploration of invisibility that Simone Weil began to develop one of the deepest and most difficult concepts of her philosophy, the concept of decreation, which is not the destruction of the self, but the undoing of the false self, the constructed ego that desperately seeks external validation and recognition. And herein lies a brutal truth that most of us doesn't want to face. Maybe the invisibility you feel is not a cosmic accident or evidence of your inadequacy. Maybe it is exactly the invitation your soul needs to start questioning who you really are when no one is watching, who you are when there is no audience to impress, who you are when all the masks fall and you are alone with the naked truth of your existence. Because Simone Weil discovered that there are two types of invisibility. There is the invisibility imposed by others, the one that dehumanizes and diminishes, and there is chosen invisibility, the one that frees you from the imprisonment of constantly needing the validation of others to feel that you exist. And the path from one invisibility to another necessarily passes through the most intense pain you can imagine. The pain of finally admitting that you have spent your whole life building a version of yourself that you expected others to see and approve of, and that this version was never really you. Have you ever felt that you are constantly performing a version of yourself that you imagine to be more acceptable, more interesting, more worthy of attention than who are you really inside? Have you ever noticed how you modify your behavior, your opinions, even your tastes depending on who is present, desperately trying to find the right formula that will finally make you seen? Have you ever noticed how exhausting this performance is, how empty it leaves you even when it apparently works, even when you get some crumb of attention or approval? And have you considered that perhaps the invisibility you fear so much is actually liberation from having to maintain this impossible performance? But before we explore how Simone Weil transformed her own invisibility into a portal to profound truth, we need to descend even deeper into the abyss of this pain. We need to look without looking away at what it really means to feel invisible in the contemporary world. Oranius, because invisibility today has specific characteristics that make this experience even more devastating than it was in Weil's time. We live in an era where visibility is currency, where likes and comments and followers seem to determine not just your social value, but your value as a human being, where you can be surrounded by thousands of digital connections and still feel completely alone, completely unseen, because all these people are looking at an image that you have projected, a carefully curated and edited version of who you are. And the more you perform that version, the more you try to be visible in the way the algorithm rewards. The more invisible you become to yourself, the more distant you become from any possibility of knowing who you really are when the cameras turn off and the screen goes dark. Simone Weil didn't have social media, but she understood this perverse dynamic perfectly. She wrote about how the human ego is constantly seeking to assert itself, to expand, to become more visible, more important, more real through the recognition of others, and how this search is fundamentally futile because the ego never becomes satisfied, is never enough. The more attention it gets, the hungrier it becomes, the more validation it finds, the more desperate it becomes for more. It's a bottomless hole that no amount of likes or praise or recognition will ever be able to fill. And what's even crueler is that while you are desperately seeking to be seen by others, you are systematically making yourself invisible to the only person who could really truly know you, yourself. Because how can you see yourself clearly when you are constantly worried about how others see you? How can you know who you really are when you're always adjusting your presentation to maximize external approval? How can you inhabit your own existence when you are always projected outward, always trying to capture other people's attention, always performing for an audience that barely realizes you exist? And here is where Simone Weil's philosophy becomes not only profound but absolutely necessary to survive the modern world. She argues that true attention, the attention that really matters, is not the superficial attention that others may or may not give you. It is the attention you learn to give yourself, but not the narcissistic attention of the ego that is always admiring itself in the mirror or cruelly judging itself. It is an attention of a completely different quality, an attention that Weil called pure, an attention that simply observes without judging, without trying, change without seeking to validate or invalidate, an attention that is just present to what is, and this pure attention, this ability to simply be present to one's existence without an agenda, without the need to make that existence seem more impressive or more significant than it is. This attention is exactly what forced invisibility can teach you if you have the courage not to run away from it. Because when you are invisible to others, when no one is seeing you or validating you or confirming that you exist, you have two choices. You can despair and intensify even more your search for external validation, or you can finally turn your attention inward and begin to explore who you are when no one is looking, who you are in the absolute solitude of your own consciousness, who you are when all the personas fall away and you are naked before yourself. And that second option is terrifying because it means confronting the void that you have spent your entire life trying to fill with external recognition. It means looking directly at the possibility that perhaps there is nothing special about you, nothing unique, nothing that justifies your existence or explains why you deserve to take up space in this world. And Simone Weil is not going to lie to you about it. She is not going to offer you any comfortable assurance that when you look within, you will find some glorious, radiant self waiting to be discovered. What she says is much more radical and much more honest. She says that when you finally have the courage to look within with true attention, what you often find first is not a radiant self, but an emptiness, an absence, a space where you expected to find something solid and substantial, but find only transparency. And the first reaction to the discovery of that emptiness is terror. Absolute, because if there is no solid self at the center of your existence, then who are you? If everything you thought was you was just construction, just performance, just ego trying to assert itself, then what is left when you stop performing? What is left when you finally admit that the person you have been trying to be is not you and never was. Simone Weil called this moment affliction, and she carefully distinguished affliction from suffering. As common, suffering is pain that you can name, that has an identifiable cause, that can potentially be alleviated. But affliction is something much deeper. Affliction is the kind of suffering that attacks not just your body or your mind, but your very soul. It is the suffering that makes you question whether you have a right to exist, whether there is any value in your existence, whether the world wouldn't be better if you just disappeared completely. And chronic invisibility, that feeling that you could disappear and no one would notice, is a specific form of grief. Because it doesn't just hurt, it questions your own reality. It makes you doubt that you are real enough to be seen, human enough to be considered, valuable enough to deserve attention. And when Simone Weil wrote about grief, she wasn't theorizing abstractly. She was describing experiences she herself had lived through. The severe headaches that had plagued her since adolescence and that left her completely incapacitated. The brutal factory work that made her feel reduced to an object. The feeling of being always the odd one out. Always the one that didn't fit in. Always the one that was a little too much or a little too little but never quite right. And instead of running away from this affliction, instead of medicating or distracting herself or numbing herself against it, Simone Weil did something that seems crazy. She decided to completely inhabit her affliction. She decided to look straight into the center of her invisibility and her pain and her feeling of worthlessness. Not because she was a masochist or because she romanticized suffering, but because she intuited that there was something crucial to be learned there. Something that could only be seen when you completely stop running away and finally consent to being present with what is, even when what is feels unbearable. And it was in this voluntary descent into the abyss of her own invisibility that Simone Weil began to realize something extraordinary. She began to realize that the emptiness she found at the center of herself, that space where she had hoped to find a solid self, but found only absence, was not defect or lack or evidence of inadequacy. That emptiness was in fact sacred space. It was the only space where something true could finally dwell. Because while that space is filled with ego, with the constant need to be seen and validated and recognized, while it is filled with the desperate performance of a self-constructed to please others, there is no room for anything true to come in. There is no room for you to truly exist as you are. There is no room for a deeper presence that transcends all the little stories you tell about yourself. And Weil began to understand that the process of decreation, this gradual undoing of the false self, is not destruction, but purification. Not annihilation, but revelation, is removing layer after layer of illusion until finally finding not a more glorious self, but something even more radical, the discovery that you don't need a great self to have the right to exist. You don't need to be special or unique or worthy of attention to deserve to occupy space in this world. Your existence doesn't need justification. It simply is. And there is a profound dignity in this simple fact that it doesn't depend on any external recognition. But reaching that recognition, reaching that place of deep acceptance of one's own existence without the need for validation from others, requires crossing territory so painful that most of us would rather remain in the prison of the ego than risk the abyss of decreation. Requires being willing to feel completely invisible, completely worthless, completely insignificant, and not running away, not immediately trying to reconstruct some comforting narrative about who you are, not desperately searching for some evidence that you matter, just standing there in the void, in the absence, in the absolute invisibility, and allowing everything that is false in you to be burned away by this experience. And Simone Weil was brutally honest about how much that hurts. She didn't romanticize the process. She didn't promise it would be liberating or enlightening or anything other than extremely painful. She described the decreation as voluntary ego death, as consent to be annihilated, as allowing everything you think to be you to be dissolved. And why would anyone willingly choose to go through that? Why would anyone accept this living death, this dissolution of everything familiar and recognizable about oneself? Well, would say it's not a rational choice, it's not a decision you make, because you weigh the pros and cons and decide it's worth it. It's something that happens when you finally get so tired of performing, so exhausted from seeking validation, so desperate under the weight of your own invisibility that you simply can't go on any longer. It's surrender. Not because you want to surrender, but because you finally realize that no. There is no more to run to, no more maintaining the illusion, no more energy to keep pretending that you are someone you are not. And in that moment of total surrender, in that moment when you finally stop fighting and allow invisibility to consume you completely, something impossible can happen. It is not guaranteed. Weil was clear about this. There is no formula, there is no technique that you can apply to make it happen. But when you are totally empty, totally decreed, totally available, because you have finally stopped trying to control how you is seen or that you think about yourself, there is a possibility that something that is not you, something that comes from outside of you, something that Weil called grace, can enter this empty space and transform your entire relationship with existence. But to understand what Weil meant by grace, we must first understand what she meant by gravity, because these two concepts are fundamental opposites in her philosophy. Gravity is the force that pulls everything down. It is the weight of the ego. It is the constant need for more attention, more validation, more proof that it matters. Gravity is what makes you desperately seek to be seen, because you believe that without being seen, you don't really exist. Gravity is the force that keeps you stuck on the hamster wheel of constant performance, always trying to be more impressive, more interesting, more worthy of attention. And the more you seek, the heavier it becomes. The more you try to lift yourself up through self-effort, the more gravity pulls you back down. Because gravity is an automatic mechanism. It is the nature of the ego. It always wants more and is never satisfied. And there is no escape from gravity through more effort, through more seeking, through more trying to build a more impressive self. You cannot overcome gravity through willpower. But grace. Grace is a completely different force. Grace is not something you can achieve or deserve or earn through effort. Grace is the opposite of gravity. It does not pull down, it elevates, but it can only elevate what is empty. It can only enter where there is room for it to enter. And that is why decreation, this voluntary emptying of the ego, is necessary, not because you deserve it. Grace after suffering enough, not because God rewards those who humble themselves, but simply because grace cannot fill a container that is already full of ego, full of narratives about who you are, full of the need to be special or important or seen. Grace can only enter into the void, and so invisibility, however painful, can be portal, can be the beginning of the emptying process that creates space for something truly transformative to enter. But what if grace never comes? What if you go through this whole process of decreation, all this suffering of allowing your ego to dissolve, all this pain of inhabiting your invisibility without trying to escape, and in the end there is no mystical revelation, no transcendent experience, no grace descending from the heavens to transform everything? Simone Weil was honest about this possibility too. She didn't promise that going through affliction would automatically lead to grace. She didn't guarantee that suffering would have meaning. What she was saying was that even without grace, even without any mystical experience or profound transformation, there is dignity in living in truth. There is freedom in stopping performing. There is relief in finally letting go of the desperate need to be seen and validated by others. Because when you stop seeking external validation, when you stop trying to construct a self that will finally be impressive enough to deserve attention, so will you. You stop being at the mercy of other people's opinions. You stop depending on others seeing you to know that you exist. You stop needing external approval to have the right to occupy space in this world. And this independence, this freedom from the tyranny of other people's opinions, is in itself a profound transformation, even if no mystical grace ever appears. But for Simone Weil, grace appeared, not once but several times throughout her brief and intense life, and she described these experiences with a precision that is simultaneously poetic and almost scientific. She did not romanticize these experiences, nor treat them as evidence of some special holiness. Experiences happened during the year 1937 when she visited Assisi, the small Italian town where St. Francis had lived. She was alone in the small chapel of St. Mary of the Angels, and something happened that she would later describe as if being forced to her knees by a force greater than herself, not physically, but spiritually. She felt a presence so powerful and so loving that all her loneliness, all her invisibility, all her feelings of worthlessness simply dissolved for a moment in that presence. She did not cease to be alone physically, but the quality of her loneliness changed completely. It ceased to be affliction to become sacred solitude. It ceased to be evidence of inadequacy to become a space of encounter with something infinitely greater than herself. And the second experience, even more. It happened during the spring of 1938 when she was at Solism, a Benedictine abbey famous for its Gregorian chant. Weil was suffering from headaches so severe that she could barely function. But she forced herself to participate in the Holy Week services, and it was during these services, surrounded by the chanting of the monks, immersed in intense physical pain, that she had an experience that she would describe as Christ descending and taking possession of her, not as a vision or hallucination, but as an absolute presence. Reality that completely transformed her suffering. The physical pain did not disappear, but her relationship with pain changed radically. She realized that it was possible to suffer intensely and still be at peace. It was possible to be in agony and still be connected to something infinitely greater than agony. It was possible to be invisible to human eyes and still be completely seen and loved by something transcendent. And these experiences did not make Simone Weil less rigorous in her thinking or less committed to working for the oppressed and invisible. On the contrary, they made her even more dedicated, because now she knew from her own experience that invisibility is not evidence of worthlessness, that suffering does not mean abandonment, that there is deep dignity even in the greatest distress if you can be present to it without running away. But Weil was also extremely careful not to turn these mystical experiences into a new form of ego, a new way of feeling special or important. She understood that even profound spiritual experiences can be co-opted by the ego, can become yet another way of seeking validation, yet another way of trying to prove that you are special. And so she continued to practice decreation, continued to undo any attempt by her ego to hold on to even these transformative experiences and turn them into a narrative about who she was. And this brings us to one of the most important and most difficult distinctions in all of Weil's philosophy, the distinction between personal love and impersonal love. Because when you are invisible, when no one sees you, what you most desperately want is personal love. You want someone who chooses you specifically, who sees you specifically, who loves you because you are you and not just anyone else. You want to be special to someone. You want to be irreplaceable. You want your absence to leave a hole that no one else can fill. And there is nothing wrong with that desire. It is deeply human to want to be loved personally. But Weil argued that there is an even deeper, even more liberating form of love, which she called impersonal love. And impersonal love does not mean cold or distant or indifferent love. It means love that is not based on specific characteristics of the loved person, is not based on them being special or unique, or impersonal. Love is amazing in some way. Impersonal love is love that recognizes the other's basic humanity, that sees the other as a human being worthy of attention and respect simply because he exists, not because he has earned that right through some special characteristic. And when you are loved impersonally, you are freed from the burden of having to be special, freed from the need to constantly prove yourself, freed from constant performance, because impersonal love loves you. Not even though you are not special, but precisely because you don't need to be special. You are loved simply because you are human, because you exist, because you suffer, because you seek, because you are alive. And this impersonal love is exactly what can arise from the void created by decreation, because when you stop trying to be special, when you stop desperately seeking personal validation, When you completely accept your own ordinariness, your own insignificance in the grand cosmic scheme of things, you become capable of receiving and giving love of a completely different quality. Love that does not demand, does not have, does not need, just is present, just pays attention, just recognizes the other as they are. But how do you practice this kind of impersonal love, this kind of pure attention that Simone Weil described as the essence of everything that matters? How do you develop the ability to look at yourself and others without projection of need, without judging, without trying to change or improve or validate? Weil developed concrete practices, not self-help exercises, but ways of being that she cultivated throughout her life. And the first and most fundamental of these practices is what she simply called attention. But attention in the sense that Weil gave to that word has nothing to do with forced concentration or intense focus. Pure attention is something much more subtle and much more difficult. It is the ability to be present to what is without trying to change it, without judging it, without interpreting it through the filter of your needs and desires. It is looking. Who simply sees, who is fully present to the object of attention without wanting anything from it. And Weil practiced this attention in very concrete ways. When she studied math or philosophy, she didn't study to get better grades or impress teachers. She studied by giving the material her full attention, allowing the material to reveal itself to her on its own terms. And she discovered that this kind of attention when studying was actually spiritual practice. It was training in paying attention to God, to other human beings, to herself, because pure attention in any context develops the same capacity to be present without agenda, of looking without the need to possess or control or validate. And for you who feel invisible, for you who are desperate for attention from others, the most radical practice Weil would suggest would be to start by giving pure attention to yourself, but not the narcissistic ego attention that is always admiring or criticizing itself. Not the judgmental attention that is constantly evaluating whether you are good enough or special enough, but attention that simply observes, that notices how you really feel without immediately trying to change or fix or improve. Attention that you can be present to your pain, to your invisibility, to your feeling of worthlessness, without running away and without holding on, just watching it all like watching clouds passing in the sky. Here is concrete practice. When you wake up tomorrow and that familiar feeling of invisibility starts to tighten your chest, instead of immediately trying to escape it through distraction or seeking external validation, simply sit for 10 minutes and pay attention to the feeling. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to justify or rationalize it. Don't try to do anything. With it, just observe. Notice where you feel in the body. Notice what thoughts accompany the feeling. Notice how you instinctively want to run away from it, and then just stay, breathe, keep observing without doing anything. And at first it will seem impossible. Your ego will scream that this is a waste of time, that you should be doing something productive, that you should be looking for solution. But Weil would say that this practice of simply being present with what is, without trying to change it, without trying to escape, is the only real path to transformation, because you can't. Transforming what you are constantly running away from. You cannot heal what you refuse to see clearly, and pure attention, attention without an agenda, is what allows you to see clearly. Second practice that Weil developed was what she called waiting, but waiting in a very specific sense, not anxiously waiting for something specific to happen, not waiting that is constantly checking to see if what you want has already arrived, but empty waiting, waiting. That is not expecting anything in particular, waiting that is simply open to whatever comes. And this empty waiting is incredibly difficult to maintain because our ego is always wanting filling the void with expectations, with plans, with narratives about how things should be. But Weil practiced pure waiting, especially in relation to God. She waited for divine presence without demanding that this presence appear in a specific way, without making conditions. Without turning waiting into negotiation, she just waited, remaining empty, remaining available, remaining attentive without expectation. And for you who feel invisible, this practice of empty waiting may seem counterproductive. You may think that you need to act, do something, actively seek to be seen. But Weil would suggest that there is profound power in simply waiting in invisibility, without trying to force visibility, in remaining available without demanding that someone see you, in being present without performance. Because when you stop desperately seeking attention, when you stop trying to force others to see you, you become capable of receiving attention of a completely different quality when it finally comes. Not superficial attention that feeds ego, but true attention that recognizes your fundamental humanity. Had a voice or choice. Consent in Weil's sense means actively choosing not to fight reality. It means to look at what is and say, yes, I see you, I recognize you, I accept that you are this way in this moment, and that requires immense courage, because our natural instinct is to fight everything that causes us pain. It is to resist, it is to try to change, it is to refuse to accept. But Weil discovered that this constant resistance keeps us stuck in the very thing we are resisting. When you fight against its invisibility, when you desperately resist the feeling of not being seen, you are giving that feeling power over you. You are allowing it to define your entire existence. But when you consent to invisibility, when you look at it and say, okay, I accept that right now I feel invisible, I'm not going to fight it, I'm not going to try desperately to force change, I'm simply going to be present to it, something extraordinary can happen. Not necessarily immediate change in the external situation, but profound change in your relationship to the situation. You stop being a victim of invisibility and become a witness to it. You stop being defined by it and become someone who observes it, someone who can be present to it without being destroyed by it. And this change of position, from object that undergoes invisibility to subject that observes invisibility, is radical transformation even if invisibility itself does not change. Fourth practice that may seem stranger, but is perhaps more transformative, is the practice of attention to beauty. Weil believed that beauty is one of the most direct ways to experience what she called decreation, because authentic beauty forces attention without allowing possession. When you look at something truly beautiful, sky at sunset, music that touches you deeply, poem that captures inexpressible truth, you are forced to give undivided attention. You cannot possess beauty. You cannot control it. You cannot make it validation of your ego. You can only look, only listen, only be present. And in that presence forced by beauty, you momentarily experience decreation. You temporarily forget yourself, your needs, your search for validation. You simply exist in the presence of something beautiful. And Weil practiced this deliberately, even when she was suffering intensely, especially when she was suffering intensely. She sought beauty not as an escape, but as a reminder of that reality is greater than your suffering, that there is something in the universe that transcends pain, and yet coexists perfectly with pain. So here is concrete practice, today or tomorrow. When your feeling of invisibility is particularly intense, instead of trying to escape it through a frantic search for external validation, find something beautiful. It could be music you love. It could be a place in nature where the sky is especially wide. It could be a poem or a painting that touches something deep within you, and dedicate 10 minutes to giving your full attention to that beauty. Don't analyze it. Don't try to use it. Beauty to make you feel better. Just look, just listen, just be present. And notice how beauty does not eliminate your pain, but changes your relationship with it. Notice how beauty creates space where both pain and joy can coexist. And fifth practice, perhaps the most difficult of all, is practice of impersonal love, starting with people you meet casually, not close people where personal love naturally arises, but strangers you see on the street, on public transport, in store. When you see these people, instead of looking through them like furniture, instead of not even really register your existence, practice paying attention for just a moment. Look at the person and internally recognize that this is a real person, with a life as complex as mine, with pains as real as mine, with a right to exist as fundamental as mine. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to talk to the person. You don't need to help them in a concrete way. Just recognize their humanity for a moment. And this recognition, however brief it may be, is the practice of impersonal love. It is training to look without need, to see without judging, to recognize another simply because he exists, and how much. The more you practice this kind of attention to others, the more you become able to receive that kind of attention in return, not because you are manipulating the universe through karma or the law of attraction, but because you are developing sensitivity to recognize when you are being seen in this true way, when someone is giving you impersonal attention that recognizes your fundamental humanity without demanding that you be special or impressive. And now we come to the deepest heart of what Simone Weil discovered about invisibility. We come to the truth that can only be seen when you completely stop running away and finally consent to inhabit your own transparency without resistance. That truth is simultaneously devastating and liberating. It is this: the invisibility that you so fear. This feeling that you cannot. It doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things that your presence or absence would make no real difference in the universe. This truth is not an illusion caused by low self-esteem or trauma or personal inadequacy. This truth is simply truth about the human condition. You are not special. I am not special. Simone Weil was not special. In the grand cosmic scheme of things, our individual existence is infinitesimally small and fundamentally insignificant, and the ego fights desperately against this truth. It constructs elaborate narratives about how you are unique, important, essential. It constantly seeks evidence of its significance. It interprets every small success as proof of special worth and every failure as cosmic injustice. But all these narratives are just defenses against the simple and brutal truth that you are a grain of sand on an infinite beach. You are a brief moment in an endless eternity. You are life among trillions of lives that have been and will be. And for ego, this truth is death. It is annihilation of everything it has built. But for soul, for its deepest being that exists before and beyond ego, this truth is liberation. Because if you are not special, if you do not uniquely matter in the universe, then you are also free from the burden of having to be special, free from the constant pressure to prove your worth, free from the need to gain external validation to justify your existence. You can simply exist, simply be here, simply live without having to constantly prove that you deserve to live. And Simone Weil would say that completely accepting this fundamental insignificance, completely consenting to not being special, completely decreeing the need to be important, that is not despair. That is the most radical freedom possible. But here is the paradox at the heart of everything well taught. In the very moment that you completely accept that you are not special, that you do not uniquely matter, that your invisibility is simply a reflection of the cosmic truth that you are insignificant, in that very moment of total acceptance, something impossible becomes possible. You become able to see that precisely because you are not special, you are connected to everything that exists, because significance that you sought was not in being unique, but in being part of the whole, in participating in existence simply by existing, in contributing to the universe simply by being. And that participation does not require you to be noticed. It does not require you to be seen. It does not require validation from anyone. You participate in existence simply by breathing, simply by being present, simply allowing life to flow through you. And there is deep dignity in this anonymous participation, in this invisible contribution, in this existence that does not seek recognition, because you have finally understood that recognition is not what matters. What matters is simply being here, simply being real, simply allowing something greater than yourself to flow through your small, temporary existence. Well, had the word for this she called obedience, but not obedience in the sense of submission to external authority. Obedience in the sense of aligning yourself with what is, of flowing with reality instead of constantly fighting against it, of allowing your life to be what it is instead of demanding that it be something more impressive or more significant. And this obedience, this surrender to what is not weakness, but the deepest strength possible, because it requires immense courage to look at the truth of one's own insignificance and not despair, not try to construct false narratives of importance, not to desperately seek external validation, just to accept and keep living anyway, keep loving anyway, keep paying attention anyway, keep existing anyway. And Simone Weil lived this. She lived this acceptance of insignificance in such radical ways that it often worried those around her. She worked in the factories, not because she needed money, but because she wanted to experience worker invisibility. She refused food other than the ration of French people under Nazi occupation, even when she was dying of tuberculosis, not because she was a masochist, but because she couldn't. Accepting the privilege of eating more when others were hungry, she refused Christian baptism despite profound mystical experiences because she did not want to belong to any exclusive group. When there was so much suffering outside any group, these choices may seem extreme. They may even seem self-destructive. And perhaps in some ways they were. Weil did not perfectly live her own philosophy. No one does. But these choices reveal absolute commitment to the idea that individual human lives should not seek to rise above other lives, should not seek special privileges, should not seek to be seen or validated or recognized as more important than any other life. And there is something profoundly liberating in this refusal to seek special significance. There is deep peace in finally stopping trying to be more than you are, in accepting that you are simply one human life among billions. Nothing more special, but also nothing less worthy of existence. So here is where we are, after walking this long and painful path through invisibility, after looking unwaveringly at the brutal truth of our fundamental insignificance. After practicing decreation and attention and waiting and consent, you have come to the point where you can finally make real choice, not superficial choice about seeking or not seeking external validation, but deep choice about how you will exist in this world that often doesn't see you. You can choose to keep fighting desperately to be seen, to keep building narratives about your special importance, to keep seeking evidence that you uniquely matter. And there is no judgment in this choice. It is understandable. It is human. It is what most of us do most of the time. Or you can choose something infinitely more difficult and infinitely more freeing. You can choose to completely accept your invisibility, completely accept your insignificance, completely accept that you are not special and never will be, and inhabit that acceptance not as defeat, but as a portal to a completely new way of existing, a way that does not depend on being seen to know that it exists, does not depend on external validation for dignity, does not depend on recognition from others, to have the right to take up space in this world. And if you choose this second path, if you have the courage to actually inhabit it and not just think about it abstractly, here is what you will discover. You will discover that invisibility you so feared was not a prison, but a key. You will discover that when you stop desperately seeking to be seen, you finally become able to see, really see, others around you. You will discover that attention you so desperately wanted to receive, you can now give freely because you are no longer desperate to receive it. Back, you will discover that love that you sought externally, you can now cultivate internally, not narcissistic love that admires yourself in the mirror, but impersonal love that recognizes the fundamental value of simply existing. You will discover that there is deep peace in not needing to be special, that there is immense relief in letting go of the burden of having to constantly prove yourself, that there is radical freedom in finally accepting that you are ordinary, one among billions, and that this is enough, more than enough. It is exactly what you need to be, nothing more, nothing less. And maybe there are no guarantees, but maybe, in the space created by this total acceptance, in the void left by the dissolution of the ego that desperately sought special significance, maybe something that Simone Weil would call grace can enter. Not because you have deserved it or earned it, but simply because there is finally room for it to enter, because you have finally stopped filling every corner of your existence with ego narratives about who you should be and have created space to simply be, and that grace, if it comes, will not make you special, will not make you important, will not make you finally seen in the way you always wanted. What she will do is transform your relationship with not being special, with not being important, with not being seen. She will show you that there is possible love that does not depend on special characteristics. There is possible attention that you do not seek to possess. There is possible connection that transcends the need for personal validation, and you will discover that you were looking for the wrong thing all along. You didn't need to be seen in the way you thought you needed. You needed to learn to see. You needed to develop the ability to be present to yourself and others without needing to transform that presence in narrative about importance. You needed to learn that existing is enough, that breathing is enough, that simply being here in this moment is more than enough, is everything. And if these words touch something deep inside you, if you felt during these minutes that someone is finally seeing not who you pretend to be, but who you really are at the center of your invisibility, if you recognized in Simone Weil a kindred soul who also struggled with feeling of not mattering and found not an easy solution but deep dignity, then leave a like on this video, because it shows me that there are others like you and like me in this world. Others who are tired of constant performance. Others who are ready to look truth in the face, even when it hurts. Others who understand that there is freedom on the other side of accepting our own ordinariness, and subscribe to the channel, because we will continue to explore these truths that most avoid. We will continue to look without diverting to what is difficult but real. We will continue to practice brutal honesty, which is the only possible basis for genuine transformation. Because you are not alone in this journey of accepting invisibility and transforming it into a portal. There are others walking this same path. And although each of us is insignificant individually, together we create something that transcends insignificance, not by making ourselves special, but by recognizing shared humanity in our common ordinariness. Simone Weil lived only 34 years. But in that short time, she looked more deeply into the nature of human invisibility than most dares in her entire life. She found no magic formula to become visible. She found no technique to finally matter in the world. What she found was something infinitely more precious. She found dignity in not mattering. She found freedom in not being special. She found love in not needing validation. And she lived these truths so radically that her life became testimony to what is possible when you finally stop running from your own transparency and learn to inhabit it as home. You don't have to die young like Weil did. You don't have to make extreme choices that she did. You don't need to work in factories or refuse food or experience Christian mysticism. What you need to do is infinitely simpler and infinitely more difficult. You need to look at your own invisibility without deviating. You need to accept your own ordinariness without despairing. You need to inhabit your own insignificance without seeking escape. And so you need to keep living, keep loving, keep paying attention. Not because you will finally be rewarded with special recognition, but simply because living and loving and paying attention is the thing to do. While you're here, it's enough. It was always enough. You just forgot because you were so busy trying to be more than enough. So busy trying to be special that you forgot that being simply human, simply alive, simply present, was already all you needed to be. And now you know. Now you've seen through the invisibility to the other side. And what you found there was not glorious self waiting to be discovered, but even deeper truth. You found that you don't need glorious self. You don't need special narrative. You don't need external validation. You need to be here. Really here, completely present, totally alive. And that is grace. Not grace descending from the heavens in dramatic mystical experience, but the quiet grace of simply existing without needing to justify existence, simply being without needing to prove worth, simply inhabiting your own life without the constant need to make that life seem more impressive than it is. You are here, you exist. You matter not because you are special, but because you are human, and that is enough. Always has been, always will be.